I've always had a strong affinity towards horde shooters, no doubt because of all the hours I spent playing Left 4 Dead back when I was a teenager, and pretty much every online game I play with my friends is a horde shooter of some kind. This is partly why I ended up raking in a playtime of over 50 hours last year with the early access build of Starship Troopers Extermination, but also because this particular franchise has been really begging for a great video game adaptation. There have been a couple of decent strategy games, but it was only with the 2005 first-person shooter where we got a glimpse of the potential the series had, that the technology back then wasn't quite up to realizing. Now here we are, over a year later with the so-called full release of Starship Troopers Extermination, that I purchased again for the PlayStation 5, and while I do think there is an enjoyable experience that could be had with this game, at the moment it's hard to recommend sadly. So let's take a look at why, shall we?
Come on, you hate! You wanna live forever?
Developed by Offworld Industries, Starship Troopers Extermination is primarily a 16-player online first-person shooter set within the universe of Starship Troopers. The core gameplay loop hasn't changed too drastically since the first early access build from last year. Essentially, you and a team of other players are dropped onto a planet infested with arachnids, and depending on the game mode, are required to complete a series of objectives that usually revolve around collecting resources from mining rigs scattered across the map, and then building a base that you have to protect from an endless horde of bugs at the end of the session. Since that first build, a horde mode has also been added, which sees you building a base and then trying to survive 10 waves against increasingly larger swarms of bugs, and honestly this is probably my favourite game mode. Mission mutators have also been added to the game that cycle every couple of hours, and these do things like increase the frequency of enemy swarms, the speed and resistance of enemies, and things like that.
This is fun.
There are now also 6 player classes now instead of 3, with each class affecting what weapons you can use, and each one comes with a special ability. Some that work on a cooldown system, like the medic has a drone that can auto-revive you, or be sent ahead to revive a teammate, which can be used 3 times before it needs to recharge. Each class has unlockable perks, making them more useful as you level them up, and a nice feature is that weapon progression is consistent across classes, so if you unlock some of the upgrades for a gun while playing as the ranger, those upgrades will be available as the medic when you use the same gun. It's not really a game that will take anyone long to figure out how to play. After a couple of missions, the core gameplay loop should start to make sense, and if you're just here to kill a metric shit ton of bugs, then you'll be just fine.
Carry on, Frank!
Which brings me to my first issue with this so-called full release, and that's the single player content that has been added. Back in June, the developers made a big announcement that Casper Van Dien, who famously played Rico in the films, would be joining the game to reprise his role in a single player component to the game, with 25 missions across various environments in this unique single player experience. Essentially, what I think everyone took this as was them making a proper single player campaign, kind of like that original 2005 game, but now obviously with better technology, and this was an exciting idea, and seemed like a reasonable addition to justify the price hike when the game finally left early access.
I regret the words we've already spoken.
Instead, this single player experience is nothing more than a fucking glorified tutorial mode, with each mission revolving around slowly introducing everything you'll see in the game, like transferring resources to a base and learning how to fight against the special bug types. This might seem all well and good, but these missions are just incredibly boring and feel like they've been thrown together at the last minute for this full release, as they're all set entirely underground in a series of recycled cave environments, making them all feel extremely repetitive. It's just lazy. I don't think it's hyperbole to say that you'd have more fun playing the 2005 Starship Troopers game than you would with this so-called single-player experience, and it feels like a real waste to bring Casper Van Dien back just for a glorified tutorial. But I guess it did work wonders for the marketing.
Let's say a troop that lives on a starship troop, if you will. Well, he worked his butt off, and he became the leader of that starship troop.
The other thing is, while having a single-player tutorial like this isn't inherently the worst idea, the way they've designed this campaign doesn't really do a particularly good job at preparing you for what the multiplayer is like, or even just selling you on the game, to be honest. Because throughout these missions, you only ever fight groups of bugs as large as about 5 or 6 at a time, compared to the multiplayer mode when you can get over 100 swarming you from all sides, set in massive open areas. And it's with the multiplayer where Starship Troopers Extermination shines the most, and that core experience that I spent 50 hours with last year is still intact here in this full release, and in a number of ways it's even better now. I mean, there's 4 planets now instead of 1, which added some much needed variety, and these are pretty large maps, so it'll take quite a few sessions before you've seen the full scope of them, given how each session randomizes the starting location and where objectives are placed. The biggest new addition is the Carnage update that originally released in version 0.8 that now makes the corpses permanent and solid throughout the game world, and this is pretty damn awesome. In earlier builds, the corpses of bugs would just disappear shortly after being killed, whereas now they only disappear if the enemy is dismembered. This now leads to some really impressive scenarios where the bugs will start climbing over the mounds of corpses and even spill over the walls and into your bases, much like in the films. My jaw honestly dropped the moment I realized that this was a new mechanic in the game, and it's something you never really get tired of seeing as you watch these bug piles build up across the session, and can lead to intense moments of panic in the horde mode as everyone rushes in to try and dismember all the bugs before the next wave comes in. Unfortunately though, I do suspect that this new feature is a big contributing factor of the game's biggest and most glaring issue, and that is the performance.
Oh my god, you're Casper Van Dien from Starship Troopers.
My PC has an RTX 3050 and 16 gigs of RAM, and it still struggled to get the early access build of Extermination running smoothly beyond medium settings. So when they announced that the game would be coming to PlayStation 5, I stopped playing on PC and decided to wait for the PS5 version, because I figured that surely the PS5 would give me a better experience.
Troopers, this sector is under plasma bombardment. Expect casualties. On the bounce. Changing mags!
No.
Nope, even on the performance mode, the PS5 version of Extermination is really poorly optimized, with lots of stuttering and slowdown, regardless of what server you're on. There are times when the performance levels out and the game runs as it should be, but more often than not you're dealing with the frame rate constantly dropping, and it just makes the experience so much less enjoyable. Agony Prime seems to still be the worst performing level in the game, as it was when it was first added in early access. I can remember the texture streaming completely breaking unless the textures were set to epic, and I'd also argue that the level now looks even worse than it did back then. Like, what happened with the lighting for this map? During so many matches the shading and lighting was so awful that I could hardly tell what the fuck I was even looking at. Apparently the experience is even worse on PC too, with people reporting that the game runs terrible even with the lowest settings enabled, and that the game crashes frequently. That I can confirm, along with other issues that I've barely scratched the surface on. The performance reportedly got worse with each update too, which is concerning.
I'm devastated.
It's all just incredibly disappointing that this is how Starship Troopers Extermination has turned out, because it was one of my favourite experiences last year, and I even put it in my top 10 games of the year video. From the undercooked excuse of a single player mode and the terrible performance, especially on PlayStation 5 of all things, this still feels like an early access game, and the increase in price feels a little bit insulting, considering it's now the same price as Helldivers 2.
No, why?
No.
As I said back in my early access preview video, this is a game with a lot of potential, and when the game is running well, it is insanely fun and one of the best Starship Troopers games we've had, and just a really damn good horde shooter in general. But right now, I can't recommend this game until something is done about the optimization, because a PlayStation 5 game shouldn't be performing this badly.
Would you like to know more?